Grieveson. Prologue. Last night I went to bed around 10 o'clock, both body and heart aching and seeking the blessing of sleep. I woke at 1:30 a.m. this morning, the bedsheets drenched with sweat. It has been like this for the last week, the sickening feeling of reality, and after a few minutes, the inevitable tears. I smoke a couple cigarettes to pass the time more quickly. Suddenly there's a tremendous crash outside my second-story window. I sit upright and a sparrow flies into the room. Its wings flap desperately as it flies from one corner of the ceiling to the others, finally perching on the frame of a painting. My heart beats wildly. This is the first night I have spent in our bed and room since my wife's funeral 3 days ago. The sparrow beats its wing against the window pane, attempting to escape, but being unable to distinguish between the glass and the narrow opening through which it entered, its antics are useless. I stretched out a hand to guide it, but startle the bird, and it flies to a higher perch in the room. "Very well, bird," I say to the sparrow. "Whether you are a sign or not, I won't be getting any sleep tonight. Perhaps you can keep me company in my grief. I will tell you a story. The story of the woman of whom you remind me so very much." Who's taken the woman with fireflies for eyes, can't cook, can't stitch, can't do anything sometimes but cool this itch? Caught her in the river, thought she was a bear, she looked at me, I saw myself in stars, she carried me across the sky to a warm painted lodge. Now she says the firewood too heavy, the river too far, but she's still a bear, makes medicines to keep me happy. Woman, strike the lodge with your one big stroke. We follow the setting sun. We forgot your sister across the sky. Karaniyaki Tati. Losh and I met the night of August 22nd, 1974. It was in the morning, actually, shortly after the pubs were closed. I was sitting in my room getting drunk with a friend when she came to the door looking for my next-door neighbor. He wasn't there. I invited her to stay, but she left. My friend left a few minutes later, and soon after she came back. She smiled, closed the door, and locked it. When we reached each other, we embraced without speaking. The warmth of her lips and the scent of her hair drove me wild with passion. Fumbling, we discarded our clothes and sank down upon the bed. We made love with an urgency and frenzy I had rarely known. When I went to sleep, she was nestled against my arm. I make no apologies for the way we met. Both of us had a sense of loneliness so very deep and a need to love so very great. It wasn't proper, I suppose, or socially acceptable. It doesn't matter. She was an Indian and I was a hippy. Neither of us cared for the moral hypocrisy of society. She was more of a woman than any woman I've ever known, more of a lady than any lady I've ever known. When we woke in the morning, it was with good-natured embarrassment that we realized we didn't even know each other's name. She told me later she thought I was funny-looking, with red hair, beard, and freckles, and the worst teeth she had ever seen. In contrast, I thought she was very beautiful. She had jet black hair which hung almost to her waist. Her complexion was fair yet golden brown. Her teeth were pearly white. Her figure was ample yet slender and well proportioned. I guess it was a case of in for a penny, in for a pound. We ate breakfast, then made love again, as if to cement our newfound friendship. The most difficult part of the morning was when my next-door neighbor, Jimbo, whom she had originally come to see the previous night, paid me a visit. He saw Losh as she came out of the washroom, and his face was pained. He asked her hard whether she had spent the night with me. She told him it was none of his business, with a harshness she didn't really mean. He left again, and I consoled her. I was living in Rochdale College at the time, and supplemented my income by getting beer for the bootleggers in my station wagon. I only charged 50 cents per case, but as I averaged 20 cases a day, It guaranteed me a case of 24 for personal consumption and a few dollars besides. Losh came with me that morning, and she thought buying 20 cases at a time was fantastic. She shared with me an uncommon fondness for the brew. It was probably one of the original reasons why she was attracted to me. After delivering the beer, I drove her over to the place she was staying. We talked in the car for a long time, reluctant to say goodbye. She came over that evening with her girlfriend and stayed that night. In the morning, she left again. For the next 2 or 3 days, we saw each other like that, together at night and apart during the day. She had told me that she intended to get a plane ticket from Indian Affairs and fly back to Winnipeg, where she came from. I agreed to drive her to the airport. The day she was supposed to leave, she phoned me to say she was sick. I drove her to the doctor's and waited in the park till she returned. When she came back, we returned to my apartment in Rochdale College, and she moved in to stay. The beginning of our relationship was new and exciting. It was like a courtship and a honeymoon all in one. We were together from the moment we woke up to the moment we went to sleep. We were so curious about each other, what happened in our past, and how we felt about the present. Losh was the name given to her and invented by her father. He said it meant "from my heart." He was an Indian of the Saulteaux tribe and built a log cabin in the woods. Her mother went to the hospital in Winnipeg when she was pregnant with Losh, but didn't get along with the doctors. The doctor examined her, didn't say hello, introduce himself, or anything else. He simply strode into the room and told her to spread her legs. His hands were cold, and she instinctively closed her knees. He ordered her to pry them wide, and when she hesitated, tried forcefully to pry them open. At this point, she punched him in the nose and gave him a nosebleed. She fled the hospital and returned to her home in the woods. Losh was born in a log cabin. Her mother went into labor behind a screen partition to prevent the other children from seeing. The local midwife couldn't be found, and Losh was delivered by her 13-year-old sister. Her first cry of life startled her sister Happy, age 3, who cried hysterically until comforted by her father. Traditional Indian manner, her mother hung the umbilical cord in a tree, thus ensuring that the newborn babe would be strong and healthy. Losh remembered her early childhood as the happiest time of her life. Her parents had 14 children. Losh was the 8th oldest. Her father was strong. As well as building their cabin with his own hands, he supported his large family by hunting, trapping, and fishing. Several times a year he went into town and traded his furs for flour to make bannock and other simple necessities. They were poor. The only dolls Losh had were wooden blocks of cedar. She slept with her parents and all her brothers and sisters in the same room. Her first memory of lovemaking was the groans and whispering of her parents when the children were supposed to be asleep. The forest, the meadows, the streams, these things Losh loved more than anything else in the world. When she was around 9, the game and animals were becoming scarce. Her parents abandoned the log cabin in the woods and moved to the reservation. Now welfare was paying the bills. Her father began drinking heavily, and fights between her parents became more frequent. When these happened, Losh would go off into the woods and cry. Her older sister, Happy, was 15 now and decided to run away from home. Losh wanted to go along and wouldn't let Happy leave without her. Eventually, her sister agreed if she got her coat from the closet. When Losh went to get her coat, Happy slammed the door and locked it. Poor Losh was left behind in the closet. She didn't see her sister again for another 7 years. Disaster struck when she was 11. Her mother, tired of the fights with her husband, left them one day and didn't come back. As soon as her father realized what had happened, he left as well. For several days, Losh, at age 9, was stuck with cooking for, looking after, and comforting 6 brothers and sisters. When the neighbors knew what had happened, they came and picked the children they wanted, each relative or neighbor taking 1 or 2 children each. The family was gone, never to really live together again. Losh attended a Catholic mission boarding school on the reservation. Traditional missionary style, they taught her everything Indian was bad, and everything white was good. It was more subtle than that, but the effect was the same. They were so eager to convert the savages by imposing the white man's culture on them that they destroyed the Indians' pride in their own history and cultural values. Losh was pressured to take a European name. Mission schools aren't so great, but Losh was extremely curious and sharp as a whip. She became an avid reader and the best speller in her school. Institutions breed institutions. When she left school, she went to reformatory for joyriding in a stolen car. Just like the mission, it was run by a white bureaucracy, and most of the inmates were Indian. One of her memories was having to dance for extra cigarettes. She met a white girl named Diane in the reformatory and became her lifelong friend. If there was one thing she learned about prison, it was she didn't like it. From the time she turned 16 to shortly after she was 21, she maintained a scrupulously clean record. At 13, she lost her virginity. It was painful, and she didn't have her first orgasm until she was 50. By then, she had already become pregnant and terminated it with an abortion. She was still wild, young, and eager to experience life. Like many of her kindred spirits, she hit the road, hitchhiking, drifting to Toronto, to Calgary and Winnipeg, and back to Toronto. I'm sure she met and loved a great many people as she grabbed onto life with both hands. The first man she lived with was a political activist called Brad. He and a colored man named Peter were part of a Maoist-orientated commune called M4M, or Red Morning. Although she lived with Brad, she was also attracted to Peter. With high idealism, they decided Losh should be able to sleep with whomever she wanted. The free love arrangement didn't work. She only slept with Peter twice, when Brad got jealous and beat her up. She left them that very night and celebrated meeting her older sister Happy for the first time since she had been locked in the closet at 9. Together they whooped it up by getting drunk on whiskey in a room at the Ford Hotel. Ironically, she was pregnant, and by the colored man, Peter. For a time she went to school, taking a manpower training course. Then, nearing the end of her pregnancy, she returned to Winnipeg. Unsure of whether or not she wanted the child, she considered having her adopted. Her sister and mother urged her to keep the child. I think the deciding factor was her tremendous loneliness and need for love. Losh decided against adopting her and moved back to Toronto, determined to raise her daughter on her own. Little Losh was born in Toronto at Mount Sinai Hospital. She was a healthy baby, brown as a berry, and enchantingly beautiful. Within a couple of months, she met a colored man called George through her girlfriend Diane. He said he loved her, and as a U.S. citizen, he needed to get legally married in order to get landed immigrant status in Canada. She had found it harder than she thought to raise little Losh by herself, and somewhat infatuated with him, they were married in Scarborough in September 1972. Losh regarded the marriage as one of the biggest mistakes of her life. After 1 month they were unhappy, and after 2 months they separated for good. Losh always used her maiden name after that. One of her greatest fears was that she would lose her treaty status because she married a non-Indian. In a pinch, she could always ask Indian Affairs for a little bread. She finally did lose her treaty status in 1975, when the marriage finally came to the attention of the Indian Affairs Bureau. Left alone with little Losh, she took another manpower training course. The burden of going to school all day and staying home with her daughter all night proved too much for her. As she became increasingly emotionally upset, she put little Losh in the care of Children's Aid. One of the frustrating yet beautiful things about Losh was her absolute honesty and spontaneity. She made decisions easily, which she thought were best at the time, but changed her mind just as frequently. She took another manpower course and then dropped out again. There is no doubt she loved little Losh very much. After a great deal of self-doubt, she got custody of her daughter back again, only to give her back to Children's Aid when the strain became too much. When she wasn't living with her daughter, the most important thing Losh had was freedom, and she used it to full advantage. She lived alone or with friends. She avoided serious relationships, but saw 4 or 5 friends on a casual basis. If many of her friends were male and became lovers, it was because Losh was a very sexual and very honest woman. She realized that sex was the climax to any male-female relationship. Losh's promiscuity was part of her search for personal freedom. It also dramatically illustrates the tremendous yearning she had for approval and love. Of course, we didn't tell each other everything in our past the first week that we met. It was a gradual process of letting down defenses and learning to trust each other. The first week of our relationship was very intense, yet casual, because we both knew she would be leaving for Winnipeg. When she changed her mind and moved in with me instead, it was an unspoken agreement rather than a conscious decision. I think I was afraid at first to love her too deeply. In fact, it was at least a month before I told her I loved her in words at all. There are other ways, however, besides words, of expressing love and nourishing it, like a seed planted in soil. One thing that was common to both of us was a tremendous capacity for sexual love. At least 3 times a day, and sometimes 4, we went through that human ritual by which man and woman reach for ecstasy here on earth. We usually awoke around 10 or 11, the sound of Bloor Street traffic filtering in through the open window. As soon as one of us was awake, we reached out automatically for the other. Hands searching, lips exploring, we would arise from slumber. It was one of the best times of the day to remain hidden under the bedsheets, flesh touching flesh, and limb touching limb. Losh was unusual to me, in that, more than any woman I have ever known, she demanded equal rights. In terms of lovemaking, this meant having an orgasm. She often mentioned to me how unfair it seemed that the male of the species had an orgasm every time, while some women never had one and others rarely. Losh didn't come every time, but usually at least once a day. It was a psychological necessity to her. You could see the tension building in her, and she would become moody and irritable. Coming was the only thing which completely relaxed her. She once said that she had a choice between missing her daily meal or missing her orgasm. She would easily give up food. Lovemaking always took an hour, or maybe 2. It was rarely that we had breakfast before noon. Sometimes I would do the cooking and sometimes Losh. It was the same with house cleaning. The office was my responsibility, but the bedroom, the kitchen, and the bathroom were a mutual concern. Losh had little in common with the kind of woman involved in woman's liberation, but she'd seen enough oppression in her life. She wanted to be treated with dignity and respect by the man she lived with. To Losh, this meant being treated as a person, rather than a stereotyped woman. After breakfast, I would usually go to work in the office in the next room. I'm a writer of sorts. An apartment we had at Rochdale College, normally renting for $150 per month, was given to me free as a publishing office. Losh was an avid reader. She read most of my works, although I think the novel Malang was the only one she really liked. I think she read every author in my library, particularly George Orwell and Graham Greene. She was extremely intelligent but shy. The longer I knew her, the more my respect grew for her intellectual capabilities. When it came to spelling, she was by far my superior. Once she told me that she envied me because I always had something to do, and it gave my life meaning. It was hard to tell her I didn't even start writing seriously until I was 24. Losh was only 20. I told her that she had plenty of time. It would probably be several years before she found something that she could develop and work on. I think she would have eventually become a writer, and one of the best. Being a writer was one of the things which attracted her to me, but I wasn't the only friend of hers with talent. Losh didn't have any patience with people who were egoists or thought or talked of themselves as arty. Rather, she chose many creative people as her friends because of her own deep creativity. Their high level of energy created a challenge for her, and she responded to it. How can I describe that first month we spent together? I think both of us began to blossom with that beauty and confidence that only love can bring forth. For the first time in 2 years I had spent at the college, my house became a home. It wasn't lace curtains or anything as funky as that. It was more like eating at home instead of restaurants. Small things like dish soap and shampoo, and the charm that a woman's underwear lends to a bedroom. We didn't go out very much. Losh hated eating in restaurants, so we could only afford the occasional show. Sometimes we went for a drive in the country or a walk in Hyde Park. Usually, when we did go out, it was to a pub. The Embassy and New Brunswick were the closest. Other pubs we went to were Grossman's and the Imperial. The Imperial was our favorite. It was quiet and cozy and served quart bottles of beer. I often had visitors at the college, some from Toronto and some from out of town. Sometimes Losh would sit and listen to us talk. It was very rare that she said anything herself, except maybe to answer questions. She was very shy. When she did talk to my friends, it was because they were interested in her, and not because they're my friends. More likely, she would sit in the other room, listening to the stereo and gazing pensively out the window. Retake. When she did talk to my friends, it was because they interested her, and not because they were my friends. More likely, she would sit in the other room, listening to the stereo, and gazing pensively out the window. The only two friends of hers who came to visit us during this period were Chris and her sister Bisho. Chris was an attractive but small-built girl. Losh had met her in reformatory when they were 15. They maintained a firm friendship over the next 5 years. Sometimes they lived together, then separated, only to meet each other again in another city and another place. They had grown up together, swapping clothes, experiences, and sometimes boyfriends. Chris was married, but unhappily so. She had fallen in love with another man and became pregnant by him. At this time she was breaking up with her husband, even though the father of her child was in jail, and would be until the child was born. Losh was a great help and comfort to her. Bisho was Losh's sister, some 3 years older than her. She came to visit us, sometimes for several days in a row, and then we wouldn't see her for a while. Losh had told me of the days when Bisho was a tigress and the wild one of the family. Once they had been hitchhiking together. Bisho had a gun in her purse when they were stopped by the RCMP. Knowing that Bisho already had a record and would be in serious trouble if it was found, Losh slipped the gun into her purse. Fortunately, nothing happened. Bisho had gone through the same mission school, reformatory, and hospital cycle as Losh. Bisho had at last straightened out. She was happily married now and had got her son back from Children's Aid. I think she had become an example to Losh, that in time things would get better. My lifestyle changed considerably after I met Losh. Even though we lived in Rochdale College, which was hectic at the best of times, we had a self-contained apartment of our own. I was no longer interested in drinking with the boys. All I wanted to do was be with Losh. All Losh wanted to do was be with me. Sometimes we would watch television. More likely we would go to bed, make love, and sit and talk for hours and hours. My lifestyle changed considerably after I met Losh. Even though we lived in Rochdale College, which was hectic at the best of times, we had a self-contained apartment of our own. I was no longer interested in drinking with the boys. All I wanted to do was be with Losh. All Losh wanted to do was be with me. Sometimes we would watch television. More likely we would go to bed, make love, and sit and talk for hours and hours. I was intensely curious about everything to do with Losh, how she felt and everything that had happened to her. Losh, for her part, loved to talk and was unquestionably honest, sometimes painfully so. In time, I think I learned about every lover she ever had, from the first when she was 13 years old to the man she picked up in a bar 2 days before we met. At times it drove me to distraction and I became insanely jealous. When this happened, she laughed and said she had already been faithful to me for a longer time than any man in her life. Wasn't it good she only talked about past lovers, that had no intention of having new ones, whether in the present or in the future. She talked quite a bit about her daughter, little Losh. It was painfully obvious how much Losh loved her and how much she missed her. She told me little Losh was the most beautiful baby in the world. I think the feeling of being incapable of looking after her was the worst feeling Losh had ever known. Little Losh was now in the care of Children's Aid for the second time. Losh knew that legally she could get her daughter back, but felt she had to prove herself somehow by getting a job or going back to school. Society has installed in all of us this image of a perfect citizen who is honest, industrious, steadfast, and unquestionably loyal. I don't think that either Losh or I filled that image or could live compatibly with someone who did. I had long ago come to peace with myself on this matter, but I don't think Losh had. Sometimes she seemed to have this image of what she should be, and felt guilty when it didn't match with reality. I remember the day she announced that she was going to find a job. I agreed that it would be a good thing because she wanted to so badly. I had my doubts about whether she could find one. Also, she had told me of the other jobs, including a week as a chambermaid in Winnipeg. A week was the longest she had ever worked at one time. To my surprise, she did find a job within a couple of days. It was in a factory packing special boxes for Christmas. I drove her to work the next morning and every day that week. My finances were always up and down. Some days I could give her a couple of dollars to buy lunch and cigarettes. Some days I couldn't. On payday, she was very happy and proud to. On payday, she was very happy and proud to have earned some extra money and being able to spend it as she wished. Nevertheless, she didn't go back to work at that factory again. Repeatedly, she told me how lucky I was to be able to pick up money through writing and hauling beer. Losh was very intelligent and hated the tediousness of factory work. Of course, having a job isn't the major qualification of having children. At least it wasn't to my mind. Losh and I discussed children. We agreed we didn't want one right now, but felt we had a duty to look after those who are already living. It was Losh's decision, of course, to get little Losh back. Losh was worried that if Children's Aid knew we were living in Rochdale College, they wouldn't give little Losh back. Accordingly, she rented a room on the outside and collected welfare as a single mother and child. They would live with me, and I would pay for all the food. What was left of her welfare checks after paying for her rent could be used to buy clothes for little Losh and spending money for herself. One morning in October, Losh came back to our apartment with her daughter. She hadn't been exaggerating at all. Little Losh was indeed the most beautiful child I have ever seen. She was brown as a berry and lively as a monkey. She was only 2.5 years old, but was already talking quite well. At first she was shy and followed her mother around the apartment, but within a couple of days she became completely at home. What a change in Big Losh. Previous to this I had known her as a lover. Now for the first time I saw her as a mother. Being with her child gave her a fresh confidence and a new beauty. She is considerate and responsible mother as any I had ever seen. Whatever other problems there had been before, they certainly weren't in evidence now. As for myself, I was even happier, if that was possible, than I had been in the previous 2 months. There were 2 women in my life now, and I don't know who was the more beautiful. It was a little crowded, I suppose. Little Losh's bedroom doubled as an underground newspaper publishing office. Between 8 o'clock at night and noon, it was little Losh's bedroom. Between noon and 6 p.m., it was an office. She slept on a mattress on the floor. Behind her bed was her box of toys. It contained a few dolls, some plastic dishes, ribbons, berets, a couple of books. Rainbow was a mischievous, little Losh was a mischievous little girl. She would wake up about 8, several hours before Mother and I got up. She would play happily with her toys, and if she was hungry, she had learned how to open the fridge and help herself. Her favorites were blue cheese, crackers, and grapes. It was only irritating when we woke up to find the fridge defrosted. She had learned to open the fridge door herself, but it took time to teach her how to close it again. It's strange the things we remember. She was fascinated by the television set and quickly learned how to change channels, but her little wrists weren't strong enough to turn it on in the first place. For that, she needed us. She was strong and independently minded, just like her mother. If it was something she could do herself, she would object strenuously if we tried to do it for her. Me do it was the inevitable response. She called Losh Mum, but we never taught her to call me Dad. She called me Brian because she couldn't get around the R. Every time I left the apartment, she would accompany me to the door, but she wouldn't say goodbye. She would wait until I'd almost reached the elevator lobby. Then she would shout, "Brian!" and run down the hallway as fast as her little legs could carry her, kiss me smack on the lips, then run back to her mother. One of the unusual things about my relationship with Mother was that she would kiss me on the lips. Don't get me wrong, we had a very loving relationship, and would hug, kiss, and caress each other over every square inch of our bodies. Only her lips were a forbidden zone. She hardly wore any makeup, and her one concession to vanity was Chanel number 5. Before she went out for the evening, she put a dab behind her ears, the throat, and her forearms. She reminded me at those times of a tigress preparing to stalk the humid jungle. Her jet black hair cascaded down almost to her waist, and teasingly played hide-and-seek with her breasts. She would sit in front of the mirror for what seemed like hours, brushing it with long, even strokes. Every once in a while she threatened to cut it, but it was easy to talk her out of it. What she wanted most was a curling iron, and I promised to get her one for Christmas. Neither of us were particularly hung up on clothes. She had several pair of faded blue jeans, which seemed to sprout holes as soon as they were patched. She had only one bra, but wore it whenever she left the apartment, feeling self-conscious without reason that her breasts had lost their firmness after the birth of little Losh. She had several tops and t-shirts. Often she would wear the same clothes for days on end, although she would bathe fastidiously every day. One day I received a parcel which I had sent from Nepal 6 months earlier. Among the items which were included were several Nepali shirts, a couple of mullah bead necklaces, and a heavy silver bracelet with a red coral stone. The gem matched the red coral stone on my ring. She wore the bracelet constantly, and the malleable metal, worn smooth after years of use, gave her a mysterious Eastern air. The Nepali shirt which Losh wore resembled an institutional design, and had a colorful and hand-painted dragon. Once in a while I would teasingly call her the Dragon Lady. The mullah beads had religious and good luck qualities. I gave one to Losh and one to her daughter. Another item in the box was a wooden devil mask. I tried it on, turned to little Losh and said, "Boo!" Poor little Losh gave a cry and ran hysterically into the arms of her mother. I didn't mean to scare her, but strangely enough it became a game with us. Every once in a while little Losh would point to the mask on the wall and cry, "Scare me! Scare me!" Putting on the mask, however, never failed to elicit tears as a result. For the first month we lived together, Losh and I never mentioned the word love. I remember the first time I told her, "I love you." It sent a shiver down my spine, and Losh began to cry. Later she told me it wasn't until little Losh came to live with us that she really began to love me in a way she had never known. For over 10 years I have smoked cannabis. Losh smoked occasionally when I met her, but then stopped. I couldn't quite understand, but she said there were some people she could smoke with, but when she was with me she didn't want to. She understood my need, however, and never complained when I spent $30 we could ill afford on a quarter ounce of hash. With her it was beer. As long as we could afford a case of 24 a day, which we split between us, she was contented. We lived like this from day to day, rarely putting any money in the bank. Somehow we always had beer, smoke, and food on the table. Our shelter was free, and there really wasn't anything else we needed. That fall was the happiest time of our lives. Everywhere we went together. If we were walking down the street, it was arm in arm. If we were sitting in a pub, it was natural as to hold hands over the table, as natural as it was for us to be together. Losh, Part 2. Children, north, south, east, west, your warmth you give, your innocent truth revealed, your dreams a reality. A heart of love you hold, a mind of peace you hold, a spirit of our grandfathers you are. Little brothers and sisters, as your older relatives, we will fight for you. Fight for your freedom to knowledge. Fight for your freedom to truth. Fight for that which we couldn't have. We unite with you in life. Your life is our life. Together we will live. Siwa. When Losh and I first met, we counted each day we continued living together as an added bonus. Neither of us at that time were willing to commit ourselves to a serious or long-term relationship. To love someone too much too early is to invite heartbreak. Losh and I had too many lovers to expect it to last forever. Gradually, from day to day and week to week, our relationship began to change. We began to expect and need each other on an increasingly deeper level. When little Losh came home to live with us in October, she was an added bond between us. It was the beginning of a new stage in our relationship. In a spiritual sense, we were man and wife. We were living common law, partly because neither of us believed in the institutional and rigid concept of marriage, and partly because she knew her legal husband needed that legality to obtain landed immigrant status in Canada. It was understood that having achieved this, he would then pay for the cost of a legal divorce. By the end of December, our common law marriage had lasted 4.5 months. Inevitably, we were entering a third stage in our relationship. The newly wedded bliss, which is common to most couples, was growing into a more mature and realistic form of love. Similarly, we were beginning to experience some of the difficulties which marriage by its nature proposes. One of these difficulties was the maintaining of an individual's sense of identity. The problem in our situation was all the more acute, because not having a straight job, we were in close proximity to each other for 24 hours a day. I solved this to some extent by writing and spending an hour or so a day drinking with the boys in one of Rochdale's famous bars. Losh solved it by seeing more of her friend Chris and occasionally seeing old friends such as Miroff the painter, Tim the waiter, and Bobby, a young Indian boy. Several times she rented a room on the outside, supposedly for welfare purposes, but also, I think, to be able to spend some time alone with her daughter and feel it was her place. It really didn't matter. We were always sleeping together, either at the apartment or her room, and neither of us really wanted to be separate from each other for more than a few hours. Children's Aid, of course, knew we were living in Rochdale College. A social worker would visit us on sporadic occasions. At first I dreaded it because I shared Losh's well-learned fear of institutions, but to be fair, this worker was a good one. If she was upset by an apartment building full of freaks, then she never showed it. She was always considerate and seemed to want to be more helpful than critical. When we took little Losh out, it was usually for a walk down Philosopher's Row, or a visit to the duck pond at High Park. The only other place we took her with some regularity was to Losh's sisters, Bisho, her husband, and her little boy Mark lived in a second-story flat on Dundas West. Mark was just turning 5, and little Losh was 2.5. They were the closest thing to a brother and sister that each other had. Both of them were real live wires. When they got together, it was a special day of fun and laughter. Losh and I went out rarely, maybe once a week at the most. Part of the problem was finding a sitter for little Losh. Rochdale had a daycare center called Acorn. It was free, but those who used its services were expected to put in time on a regular basis. I often urged Losh to participate, not only because it would have solved the babysitter problem, but I thought it would have been good for little Losh to play with children of a similar age. Losh agreed with me, at least in theory, but never carried it into practice. As much as anything, I think it illustrates her basic shyness. I wasn't all that sociable either. I much preferred Losh's company in our own apartment to the various parties, which ran on an almost continuous basis. Losh was one of the most intelligent women that I have ever met. Her pronunciation of the English language was faultless. I remember her giving me shit for pronouncing the T in rapport. Likewise, her spelling was excellent. As a writer, I didn't even have a dictionary, but if I came to a word I didn't know, I would call out to Losh. And all the time I knew her, she was only wrong once. Her memory for numbers was also phenomenal. She didn't have a telephone book, but kept all the numbers in her head. If I met a friend who gave me his number, but I didn't have a pen with me, I would ask him to repeat it to Losh. Having only heard it once, she would be able to give it to me even a couple of weeks later. I learned that she had inherited this talent from her mother. A couple of times we went to the show. I remember seeing The Sting and Freebie and the Bean. Most of the time we went to the Roxy on Davenport Road. Losh would put 6 beer in her purse, and we would sit in the last few rows and watch the double feature for the incredible price of 99 cents. Having a station wagon was fairly convenient. We used it for taking little Losh to High Park, visiting her sister or my parents in Hamilton. It was just as good for getting groceries as beer. Besides the beer runs, I occasionally hired myself as car and chauffeur to bring home some extra cash. Once we drove a musician called Blue, 2 other band members, and all of his equipment up to Huntsville to play a gig. Losh and her daughter came along to keep me company on the return trip. It was a long drive, and when we got there we couldn't even get something to eat because it was a licensed dining room and wouldn't let little Losh in. Sometimes Losh and I were convinced it was the rest of the world that was crazy, not us. On 2 other occasions I drove people from the Rock up to Quebec to look at land. They were 3 to 4 day trips, and Losh stayed behind with her daughter. Chris, her girlfriend, would come over and stay with her. This wasn't any guarantee, however, that they would stay out of trouble. One time when I came home, she told me with some embarrassment that Chris and her had passed out in the elevator lobby during a second-floor party and woke up there the next morning. Drinking was one of Losh's great problems, as well as one of her great pleasures. In the smallest way, it began to affect her waistline. All the beer and the high-protein diet we ate of bacon and eggs and steak and potatoes began to show as she put on weight. She was becoming self-conscious about it, yet she was as beautiful as ever. The worst problem was its psychological effects. It didn't happen every time she drank, for we drank every day, but alcohol seems to precipitate the effects. Sometimes she would become extremely moody and argumentative. If she was drunk enough, she would lose all ability to reason and throw things violently, or say things spitefully to cut and wound. Fortunately, these episodes were rare. As the weather grew colder, we bought warmer clothes from the Salvation Army and began to look forward to Christmas. Losh began knitting a scarf for her daughter. The candle makers who had educational space on our floor went into full season production, and I picked up some extra cash with the station wagon by taking them down to Yonge Street with their candles in the morning and picking them up again after supper. A colored man named Jimbo, who lived next door, was in the habit of coming around my place a lot. But after that morning, when he discovered Losh in my apartment, he didn't come around for a month. Losh had been quite fond of him, though she only saw him once a week, and had maintained a relationship with 4 or 5 other lovers at the same time. He must have been quite bitter when Losh refused to have anything to do with him after she met me. He was getting increasingly into dealing drugs. On November 24th, 1974, some friends of mine and his gave him $1,500 to buy some hashish oil. He didn't reappear for over a month, claiming he'd been busted at a house in High Park and arrested under a phony name. After supposedly being held for 30 days, he said he was released on personal reconnaissance December 24th, the day before Christmas. He said the police had confiscated the cash during the raid. My friends were understandably disappointed. Not all the money had been theirs, and they had been beaten up because of his failure to reappear. Losh took his side, saying she doubted that he would have ripped them off deliberately. I wound up supporting her. About a week before Christmas, Losh and I drove out in the country and picked up a spruce tree. Then we drove back to the college and put the tree up in our bedroom. We all helped in the decoration, even little Losh, who put great gobs of tinsel on the lower branches. When the lights were finally on, we lay back on the bed with an arm around each other and felt a peace and contentment we had never felt before. It wasn't just the tree, it was being together as a family. Usually Sunday was our day to go for a walk and get some exercise. We would drive down to High Park. The ground would be covered with snow, white snow, unlike the city streets. The air would be crisp and fresh, a distinct change from the apartment building. Little Losh was bundled up in her red snowsuit, with a scarf practically covering her face. She pronounced snowball as no ball, being unable to master the S. Her mother and I would walk hand in hand up and down the hills, laughing and getting snow in our boots. Sometimes we would let little Losh feed bread to the deer, or let her feed crust to the ducks. Who never failed to scramble for the booty and make us laugh. How can words describe the beauty of a woman? I knew her best in bed as we lay together with our nakedness touching each other. In time her body became more familiar to me than my own, from the parting in her hair and the coarse but luxurious black waves that cascaded down to her waist. Her deep brown eyes, which reminded me of hidden pools in the forest. The tiny black hairs all but invisible on her upper lip. The curve of her neck and the gentle slope of her shoulders. The fullness of her breasts, waterbed tits she called them, and the copper tone of her nipples, as large as silver dollars. The gently rounded curve of her belly and the stretch marks which came with the birth of little Losh, and showed the matureness of her womanhood through her age, though her age was only 20. The endless black curls of her pubic hair and the slope of her thighs, the white marks on her kneecap where she was scarred with an axe when she was a child, and the turn of her ankles, and the dark hues of the soles of her feet, a legacy from her love of walking barefoot. Sometimes I used to tease her that she looked more like a Blackfoot to me than a woman of the Saulteaux tribe, but the pun wasn't always appreciated. For Christmas I got Losh a hairdryer and a portable radio. She bought me an expensive meerschaum pipe. Little Losh did the best of all of us. She got a sleigh, a tricycle, though she could barely touch the pedals, and numerous dolls, toys, and soap animals to play with in the tub. Disaster struck a couple of days after New Year's. Bobby, her young Indian friend, brought around an old friend of hers with whom Losh had been carrying on an affair with shortly before we met. As she had told me all about him, I wasn't really fancy about entertaining him in our home. Losh, however, sat on the bed beside me with her arm around me, as if to reassure me that there wasn't any need for jealousy on my part. When they left, she walked them to the elevator lobby. The next day she told me that she had made a date to meet him in a downtown bar, just to talk about old times and mutual friends they had known. She asked my permission to meet him there. I wasn't so hot on the idea, but I loved Losh, and where there's love there must also be trust. I told her it was okay if she promised to be back by 10 p.m. 10 o'clock came and went, and still no sign of Losh. I put little Losh to bed and sat by the window getting drunk and watching the snow fall outside on Bloor Street. By 3 a.m. I knew the bars had long since closed, and I had to face the fact that she might not be coming home at all. I alternated between extreme rage, imagining how I would beat the shit out of them, and extreme tears, asking myself, how could she do this to us? Several times little Losh got up crying, came over me asking where Mummy was. I would hold her, stroking her hair, and tell her Mummy would be home soon, though I no longer believed that myself. When she had quieted down, I would tuck her back in bed with her doll. Sleep was impossible for me. I was an emotional wreck and my nerves were completely shot. Keeping drunk and stoned was the only way I could keep from going insane. She still hadn't come home when her sister Bisho phoned at noon and asked for her. I told Bisho that Losh had gone to meet a friend the previous evening and hadn't come home. Bisho started crying. She knew how much I loved Losh and how much her daughter and I had meant to her. She realized that the whole relationship had probably been blown, just when it was looking so good and as if Losh had settled down at last. She offered to come over as soon as her husband Phil returned from work. Bisho and Phil came over at 4 p.m. The first thing they asked me was whether I telephoned the police and the hospitals. I shook my head, because I knew in my heart that that wasn't what had happened. Phil did the phoning for me and confirmed that Losh wasn't in jail or the hospitals. They wanted to put out a missing persons bulletin, but I wouldn't let them. Then they offered to take little Losh for a couple of days. I agreed because I could hardly look at her without breaking into tears. All I could think of was getting out of that goddamn room. The matter was complicated by the fact I was safeguarding a stash of $8,000. This was unprecedented for me, but I had agreed to do it because having a wife and daughter had imposed an extra financial responsibility and burden. I was to receive several $100s for my trouble. Several times during the day I tried to get someone I trusted to take care of it for me, but without success. Losh showed up around 6 p.m. and threw herself on the bed. I asked her why in hell she had done this to us. She couldn't answer but hugged me and burst into tears. Then she got up and ran out the door. I didn't bother chasing her. All I wanted to do was go out, get drunk, and get laid. I wasn't horny at all. Somehow I reasoned that unless I did, I could never forgive her. My pride would stand in the way. On the other hand, if I did get laid, I'd be no better than she was. I locked the door and hurried out the front lobby of the college. Hailing a cab, I gave the driver instructions to drop me off at Yonge Street downtown. No sooner had we arrived at our destination when I was approached by two husky men who identified themselves as RCMP officers. They searched me but let me go again because I was clean. Immediately I went to a bar and drank a few beers to steady my nerves. The first place I chose to go afterwards was a body rub parlor on a side street. The girl looked slightly familiar, though I couldn't remember where. I was far too emotionally upset to maintain an erection. Finally she gave me oral sex, and I got dressed and took a cab back to the college. When I reached my apartment, my worst fears were confirmed. The door I had locked was open. My room had been ransacked. Not the messy way that narcs did it, but professionally, as if whoever did it knew exactly what they were looking for in the 2 or 3 places it could possibly be. I sank down in a chair, numbed by shock. Within 2 days, my whole life had fallen apart. Losh had left me. I had been searched by the police. I had been ripped off for $8,000, which wasn't mine and which I couldn't possibly repay. I had no clues as to who had done it. It could have been the Greenies or the police. If it wasn't the police, then I would likely be killed. It even overshadowed my problems with Losh. If I was in prison or dead, it wouldn't matter if she loved me or not. Losh came back that evening. I told her what had happened, including getting laid. She was in pretty bad shape herself. Her face looked drawn and tired, and her hands shook. It was too much drinking, too little sleep, and too much worry. She didn't talk much, cried a bit, and left again. I didn't try to stop her. On the 3rd day she came back again. She had spent her entire welfare check and lost her purse and her identification papers. She asked if she could stay. I said it didn't matter anymore. Then contradicted myself and said it did matter, that I wanted her to stay, that it would never be the same again. Both of us were emotionally exhausted. For the first night I remember since we had been together, we didn't make love. She fell asleep crying on my shoulder. We didn't make love in the morning either. I made breakfast for us and asked her if she had anything to do with the disappearance of the money. She looked really hurt when I asked her and said no. I apologized for asking. I never seriously considered she could have, or would have, but she had the only other key to the apartment. The absence of both of them raised a lot of questions. Meanwhile, I had a lot of explaining to do. The necessary people were informed of what had happened. Meetings were held. The friend for whom I'd been safekeeping the money came down to the college in person. Together we went to security and emphasized we were interested in avoiding bloodshed. All we wanted was the money back. Security understood the problem. $8,000 was a lot of money. People robbed banks, and the cops and robbers shoot each other for that kind of stake. They decided to do a complete room check of the building. We went down to the second floor to find additional members of security. No sooner had we stepped out into the second floor lobby than a man rushed past brandishing the brass nozzle of a fire hose. He was bellowing that someone had ripped him off. I guess the man he was looking for came around the corner from the opposite direction and brandishing a machete. They were both giant men. In the few seconds that it took to understand what was happening, one man's finger lay on the floor, and both of them were covered with blood. In fact, blood was spurting from wall to wall. Security jumped in and separated them. An ambulance was called but didn't show up. The police arrived immediately. Word spread quickly that the fight was over a rip-off of $1,000. My friend and I looked at each other, both of us thinking the same thing. We didn't want that to happen to us. Shortly afterwards, we went back to my apartment. As soon as I opened the door, Losh jumped up, crying my name, with tears streaming down her face. She ran to me and threw her arms around my neck, saying she had heard there was a stabbing on the second floor over a rip-off, and she thought it was me. I held her closely, stroking her hair and saying, "It's okay, Losh. It's all going to be okay." After supper, we drove over to her sister's place and picked up little Losh. The next couple of weeks were particularly depressing. My relationship with Losh had changed. I still loved her, but the unspoken bond of trust had been shattered. Maybe it was just conforming to reality. Losh and I, after all, were different people. I was much more idealistic, also puritanical. Witness the differences in ages that we lost our virginity. She was 13, I was 23. She used to tease me about that. Yet I think she felt as strongly as I that the 3-day bender had been a huge mistake. Her friend quarreled with his wife and lost his job because of it. The trust that had been broken would heal, but it would take time. It even affected our relationship with little Losh. Like each other, we loved her very much and had begun to think of ourselves as inseparable. The fact that we had been separated, if only for 2 or 3 days, was quite a shock. What if it happened again? I was well aware that if Losh left, I couldn't take care of her myself. I couldn't even love her in the way I did before. It made me too vulnerable. Losh also suffered deeply from the change in her relationship with little Losh. The guilt of leaving her was as great as the guilt of betraying me. It also brought back all her old fears and insecurities of being incapable of being a proper mother. One explanation she gave of what had happened was that she wasn't mature enough to handle the responsibilities of a heavy emotional relationship. She felt that the responsibilities of having little Losh added to the burden of our own relationship, and her dissatisfaction at being tied down with no possibility of escape. She said she was thinking of putting little Losh back in the warships of Children's Aid. I insisted it was not a decision to be made quickly while we were still upset. I suggested that we continue as usual and give our wounds time to heal. One thing she suggested, and I agreed, was the desirability of moving out of Rochdale College and getting an apartment on the outside. The incident had completely destroyed any chance I had of publishing the Rochdale file myself. I had been depending upon sales from the book to support us after we moved from the college. Fortunately, I had already finished a collection of underground comics. At publisher prices, this would give us a potential return of $810. Whenever we found a babysitter for little Losh in the afternoon, Her mother and I would hop in the station wagon and cruise around Toronto looking for apartments to rent. It wasn't easy to find what we wanted. Our total resources were $250 in the bank. Most apartments wanted first and last month's rent in advance. The kind of rent we might be able to afford was usually an upstairs flat in a private home. For the most part, Losh and I were getting along well, but when we did fight it was quite noisy. It was imperative that we have some privacy. It was also necessary to get a two-bedroom apartment. In Rochdale, little Losh had to use the office to sleep in. I was determined that this time she would have a room of her own. Finally, we found a place near Wellesley and Sherbourne at $200 per month. We talked the landlord into letting us move in for the first month's rent, the balance to be paid as soon as I received my imaginary check from my imaginary job. When we did move in, we had just enough left over to put gas in the station wagon and buy $20 worth of groceries. We had no stable form of income and had no idea how we could meet next month's rent. In fact, all we had going for us was a little bit of faith and a whole lot of love. Losh, Part 3. Ottawa. Ottawa, your very name springs from native sources, and yet you treat your natives worse than Mounties treat their horses, shooting, gas, and clubbing us when we petition you, while indoors Parliament sips tea and eats some sweet cakes too. Canada no different than your neighbors to the south. A wounded knees is coming here. Please listen, shut your mouth. The blood of native peoples smeared the writing on the wall, and those too ignorant to read it shall hear the war cry call. Bob Bacon. Our newer apartment was far larger than we expected. It had a fair kitchen, large living room office, a master bedroom living room for Losh and I, and a smaller bedroom for her daughter. The walls were freshly painted and there were shiny hardwood floors. Losh cooked supper while I finished unpacking. We quit around 8. Little Losh was sent to bed while we lit the candle on the mantelpiece and turned on the stereo. I felt great, like it was a new start in a new home. Losh was happy and proud. She said it was the best apartment she had ever lived in. We did a lot of hugging and fondling until the fever raged inside of us and we christened the new apartment. We had moved in on a Friday, and all weekend we did those little things which makes a house more comfortable, like putting the pictures up on the walls and putting the books on the shelves. All in all, it was a pretty good time, except for running out of beer on Sunday morning. It came all the more of a shock when Losh announced that she'd come to a decision regarding little Losh, and would take her over to the Children's Aid office on Monday afternoon. I didn't know what to say, except I was sorry if it had to be that way. Losh was very possessive of her daughter, claiming it was her responsibility and no one else's. I think the fact she had only slept with the father twice and that none of her relationships with men, excepting myself, had lasted over 2 months, accentuated this possessiveness. But also the feeling it was a burden. It was too much of a burden to handle herself. In the morning we went to welfare. We took little Losh with us at my insistence, because there's no other explanation we could give them for having rented a 2-bedroom apartment. Little Losh was very moody and demanded continuous attention. Children are very sensitive concerning emotional upheaval, even if they are too young to intellectually understand the problem. I believe little Losh was an exceptionally sensitive child. In the afternoon we took her over to the Children's Aid office. It took several hours because of the papers to fill out and the compulsory medical examination. When we put little Losh in the social worker's car and kissed her goodbye, tears flooded my eyes. The only reason I didn't weep on the spot was to make it easier for her mother. I think her mother reacted similarly out of concern for me. When we got back to the apartment, I went out and bought some beer. It may not cure the problem, but it helps deaden the pain. The place wasn't the same though. It was so quiet and depressing with just the two of us. Losh took it really hard. At times she would go into little Losh's bedroom and close the door. There wasn't much there except her mattress, blankets, a box of toys, and the bicycle we had bought her for Christmas. I would hear Losh crying, but respected her privacy and waited until she returned to our bedroom before I comforted her. I used to think that parents gave up their children because they didn't love them enough. I know in Losh's case this wasn't true. She loved her daughter more than anyone in the world. I hope little Losh can understand this when she grows up. I don't know what Losh's problems were. I'm sure it had something to do with being abandoned herself when she was 11 years old. I don't know, and Losh couldn't communicate that to me. I know she spent some time in a mental hospital, but that was one of the few things that she wouldn't talk about. It was only after we moved into Wellesley Street that she told me her psychiatrist's office was across the road. She had the psychiatrist for over a year, but had never met him. Typical of Losh, she only phoned him in times of emotional crises and then made an appointment. Of course, by the time the appointment came around, she was feeling better and never bothered showing up. Financially, things were very tight. We got a check every 2 weeks from welfare, and immediately set enough aside to pay for the rent. Then waited enough to buy 3 or 4 days worth of groceries and give Losh $5 spending money. To cover food, beer, and cigarettes for the other 11 days, I had to hustle money any way I could. The comics came in useful. I sold them to Toronto stores a little at a time as we needed the money. We were never rich and couldn't have paid the rent without welfare, but the books helped to tide us over the worst spots. Also, I had given up trying to raise the money to publish the Rochdale file myself. Instead, I was looking for a publisher who would give me a $500 advance. There was another book I was publishing called Diary of a Yeti. I expected it would provide us with additional income in the fall. If we were poor, it didn't prevent us from being happy. We woke up in the morning naturally without the aid of an alarm clock. We were eager to touch each other, talk, and make love. After a while, we'd make breakfast and clean the house. Everywhere we went together, whether it was laundry, shopping, going for a couple of beers, or just a walk. I'd say 90% of the time we were in a state of bliss, though the other 10%, I admit, could be pure hell. Our apartment on Wellesley Street was at the edge of Cabbagetown. There were 2 local pubs that we used to frequent. One was called the Winchester Hotel on Parliament Street. It was a bit of a dive, most of the customers being older and of lower class origins. At night it was noisy, and fights were not infrequent. The Isabella Hotel on Sherburne Street was a little better. The clientele was just as old and just as noisy, but fights were less frequent. It was the closest hotel and one of our favorites. Often we would drop over in the afternoon or evenings for a few Molson exports. Our traditional seat was a small table near the buzzer, which called the waiter, and was close to the jukebox. Sometimes the city would get us down, and we would go for a drive. Anywhere would do. A drive in the country, the lakeshore, or maybe a trip into Hamilton. Bad luck seemed to follow us, though, concerning the car. We had only been at our new place a couple of weeks when we heard the scrunch of metal outside. Sure enough, this dude had lost control of his car and smashed into my parked station wagon. One door and window was completely totaled. The other door wouldn't open because the frame was bent. The driver asked us to settle privately so his insurance rates wouldn't go up. We agreed and settled on a price of $250. The bastard paid us $50, then ignored us. There was nothing we could do about it, because we had already accepted partial payment. The wagon sat on an empty lot for several weeks. Then I began to use it again. Almost immediately I got a ticket to take it for a safety check. Determined to have one last fling, Losh and I went to Hamilton, had a few beers, and decided to go to Buffalo. It was raining and the roads were slippery. We were partially drunk and arguing with each other when we reached the Stony Creek traffic circle. We were doing about 65 when I saw a yellow sign dash by. By the time I realized it said 30 miles per hour, we were already at the curve. Like a dream in slow motion, we slid off the road. 5 or 6 iron surveying stakes came at us like telephone poles. Incredibly, I maintained control of the slide. Realizing there was no other traffic around, regained the road and turned off up the highway. We were just in time. All the side windows were smashed, one tire completely flat, and the car was filling up with smoke. We sat for a moment recovering our breath, then threw our arms around each other. I was so glad that we were still alive and no one had been hurt. Losh amazed me by her calm acceptance of the situation. There were no hysterics, no recriminations. The car was totaled. We just picked up what we could carry and hitchhiked into Hamilton to spend the night at a friend's. The next day we sold the car for scrap and took the bus back to Toronto. After that, everywhere we went was by bus or on foot. One of our favorite places to walk was Wellesley Park overlooking the Don Valley. We had started going there in the winter when there was still snow on the ground. As spring came, the snow began to disappear. The trees began to bud and the land came to life. We would go to the park almost every day. Losh carried a six-pack inside her purse. We would spend an hour or two lying on the grass, holding hands, rapping, and just communicating with nature. One morning, Losh announced she was going to move out and get a place of her own. I was too hurt to argue, too proud to beg her to stay. Instead, I went to the Rock and began drinking. Late in the afternoon, I met a couple of girls I knew and took them downtown for some beer. One of them I had been particularly attracted to, but because of the love and loyalty I felt for Losh, had never consummated the relationship. Around 6 or 7, I suggested we go back to my place and smoke some dope. We went by taxi and picked up a case of 24 on the way. I was positive that Losh would already be gone and there'd be nothing left to me but a note. I was wrong. Losh and her young Indian friend Bobby were sitting in the living room by candlelight with the stereo turned on. I was surprised to see them together as they were to see me with the girls. After polite hellos and some embarrassment, I took the girls into the office. Then I heard Losh crying and couldn't help going to see her. She was hugging Bobby and sobbing on his shoulder. I moved up slowly behind her. What a strange sight it must have been. Losh with her arms around another man while I stroked her hair, saying, "I love you, Losh. I really love you." Then I noticed one of the girls standing in the doorway and grew embarrassed. I went back into the office and we decided to put on our coats and go back to the Rock. We had just reached the hallway when Losh jumped up. It happened so quickly it was over before I knew it. Losh literally pushed the two girls out of the apartment and slammed the door behind them. Then she turned to me, eyes blazing, and asked where the hell I thought I was going. It all happened so quickly and comically that I began to laugh. Then I held her in my arms. Bobby disappeared in the kitchen to make himself something to eat. Losh and I made passionate love on the bed, vowing we would never leave each other. Love of the kind we shared is inevitably possessive. Losh and I were naturally attracted to some friends of the opposite sex. By coincidence, I never liked the men that were attracted to her, and she never liked the women that were attracted to me. To be fair, I spent much more time being jealous of her than she spent being jealous of me. Except for Chris and her sister Bisho, all of her friends were male. She felt guilty about that sometimes, but couldn't change what she was. She would meet someone, become their friend, and see them once in a while. If the relationship showed signs of becoming sexual, she would drop them and see other people. One result was that we had few friends in common. It was necessary, however, not to let jealousy possess us. We gave each other as much understanding and leeway as possible. Once, when I was getting jealous, she touched my manhood and said I knew how important that was to her. Then she pointed out she had lived with me for over 8 months, and surely I could guess the reason why. With that, she gave me another squeeze. I felt the same way about her. Just lying in bed beside her was enough to give me an erection. We've been living common law for over 3/4 of a year, and we were still doing it twice a day, possibly 3. A few months after we had moved into Wellesley, I found definite proof of who had ripped me off in Rochdale. It was the same good neighbor of ours that had supposedly ripped my friends off for $1,500. Now a third party had the same grievance. I even went to the trouble of checking out the story he had given my friends who lost the 1,500. Likewise, I found it to be false. Meanwhile, he was flashing money around and driving a Mercedes-Benz without any visible means of support. I swore that I would get revenge, not by putting sugar in his gas tank or breaking his arms and legs, but by someday telling the truth. My friends who lost the 1,500 felt the same way. There was nothing they could do about it legally. The alternative was so horrible they didn't want to incur the bad karma. They felt like I did, that sooner or later he would cross somebody who would kill him. It was just a question of time and karma would get him. The third party, however, thought karma should be hurried along. Before they could take any action, they were busted. Losh and I were busted the same night. We'd been having a mild argument when the doorbell rang at 3 o'clock a.m. Losh answered the door without thinking to ask who it was. Almost immediately a man swung into the bedroom, pointed a loaded shotgun at my head, and said, "Freeze!" I was in bed and just in the process of sitting up. Immediately I lay back down again. Two other men shoved Losh into the office, pointed a pistol at her, and told her to put her hands on top of her head. Then they proceeded to ransack the place. It was a good 10 minutes before we even realized it was the cops. At first I thought it was some goon squad hired to take the missing cash out of my hide. Losh told me afterwards she was thinking the same thing. It was almost a relief to know they were the police. They really tore the place apart, but all they found was 3 grams of hashish. Their attitude softened considerably. They told me they'd been acting on a tip there were large quantities of LSD in the house and that we were armed. Obviously, they'd been given a bum tip. They wrote both of us citations for possession of hashish and left. Losh was crying. I held her close, trying to comfort her. I assured her there was no way she'd be convicted. For one thing, I would testify that in all the time I knew her, she had never smoked dope. While admitting myself, I used cannabis quite freely. Under those circumstances, if anybody was found guilty, it would be me, although it was still possible that both of us would get off. On the surface, it wasn't such a serious crime. Even if the worst happened and I was found guilty, the standard penalty for first-time possession was only a $100 fine. It continued to bother both of us, though. For one thing, we couldn't understand why we had been singled out for a raid. It looked like someone was out to get us. Both of us had clean police records as adults, and desperately wanted it to stay that way. Losh because she had until August to decide whether she wanted her daughter back. Me because I would continue to smoke cannabis for the rest of my life. Any conviction for a narcotic charge would be the beginning of a one-way ticket to prison. Both of us had suffered juvenile detention homes in our youth. Neither of us wanted to be in that position again. The next day we got legal aid. Losh got an excellent lawyer because he was an old friend of hers. Sometimes Losh said she should have been born rich. If she didn't have wealth, she had taste. Maybe not in the clothes she wore, for she dressed very simply, but in everything from the movies she watched to the records she listened to. Of the several paintings I have, there is one that was her favorite. It was done by an Indian friend of mine called John Redbird. Losh knew his brother Duke. The painting was 3 bare and desolate spruce trees in reddish-black shadows against a reddish-orange sky and a big yellow sun with an aura. It hung in honor above that mantelpiece. One day Losh asked me for it, and I gave it to her, writing an inscription on the back. With love to Losh, whom I love more deeply than love itself. There was one other thing she requested from me. There's a wall hanging 10 feet high on black satin. On it, an image was silkscreen in white of a knight from the Middle Ages. The knight carried a shield with a crest and a tall spear. At his feet lay a lion, which had its teeth sunk into the shaft of the spear. It was an original silkscreen, the only one of its kind in the world, had been purchased by one of the more successful dealers of Rochdale. He in turn gave it to another dealer, and it passed in a tradition through 4 or 5 people. It was given to me by a friend who stayed with us for a month. Losh loved this. I gave it to her as a present, assuring it was hers to keep, even if we broke up. After that incident in January, we threatened to break up a lot, usually during a fight or just preceding one. One night we went to the Roxy with a small case of beer. I had already satisfied the initial demand of the Toronto bookstores for the comics. I decided to take 100 up to Ottawa and Montreal. This was to be our last night together for 4 or 5 days, and we were celebrating. We enjoyed the show, and afterwards we went to the Lansdowne Inn, a pub across the street that served quart bottles of beer. We held hands across the table and talked of Ottawa and the times we had been there. There was also the night she told me she wanted. That was also the night she told me she wanted to give me something, a child. We had both started celebrating early and were quite drunk. In a while, Losh closed her eyes and rested her head on the table. I should have woken her up, but she looked so peaceful that I let her sleep while I finished the beer. It wasn't until the waiter came around complaining they were closed that I nudged Losh's arm. She was sound asleep, and not even shaking her would wake her up. Finally, at the waiter's insistence, I put my hands under her arms and lifted her clumsily and bodily. Losh woke up all right. She was also angry as hell. As soon as we got outside, she started swearing at me and said she couldn't wait until I left so she could ball the first man she met. It was the worst thing in the world she could have said to me. I saw red and slapped her face. Poor Losh was caught unbalanced and went down like a rock. When I helped her up, her lip was bleeding. She refused to go home with me, but I refused to leave her. After arguing on the sidewalk, we took a cab back to the apartment and made love. I sold out in Ottawa and didn't have to go to Montreal. On the 5th day, I took the bus back to Toronto. Losh seemed glad to see me. We lay down on the bed and held each other, but somehow she seemed distant. I asked her what was wrong. She told me that the first 3 nights she had slept alone in our apartment, but the 4th night she had gone out drinking with her friend Tim. That night she slept at his house in an empty bed. During the night, a friend of his came to her, and she didn't turn him away. Once again I saw red. I'd often told her that if it happened again we were through, finished. What could I do? Tell her to split? I still loved her. How could I live this way? She was crying and begged me not to make her feel worse and said, "Beat me, beat me." In a rage I slapped her 5 to 6 times. When we made up a few hours later, we made love with desperation and came together. She told me that night she was leaving me and getting a place of her own. She even phoned a friend, the painter, and made arrangements to stay there until she found a rented room. I gather she told him of the beating, for he offered to come and pick her up. She asked him to wait until 9 in the morning to come and help her move. Losh set the alarm. We didn't get to sleep until late. When we woke in the morning, I was appalled by the swelling and bruises on her face. I apologized profusely. She said she loved me but had lost all respect for me. We barely had time for a coffee before the doorbell rang. Losh had already packed. I hadn't met her friend the painter, and I didn't want to. Before she left, she wrote down his telephone number on a piece of paper and asked me to telephone her in the afternoon. I did phone in the afternoon. We met that evening in a bar for a couple of drinks, and later went back to our apartment. We made love, and Losh slept with me that night. For the next 5 days she left me every morning, came back every night. On the 5th night she came home to stay. We would have many fights after this, but it was the last time I hit her, the last time she was unfaithful to me. For better or worse, we loved each other, needed each other. We had no choice but to try again. We got mad at each other several times after that and threatened to break up. Whenever this happened, we would go cry on friends' shoulders. Sorrowfully, I would announce to my friend it was over. We were definitely through. My friend would raise his eyebrow quizzically and say, "Oh yeah?" Losh had the same problem. We broke up so frequently and made up the same night that we lost credibility. Nobody believed us, least of all ourselves. One day Losh told me some friends of hers were moving and asked if we could take care of their dog. I said sure. It was quiet around the house with just the two of us. Friends dropped by rarely. The dog's name was Justin. He was part setter and part receiver. Losh made such a fuss over Justin that sometimes I actually felt jealous. She insisted that she be the one to feed him, and spent endless hours brushing his hair in the front room, sitting on her knee, listening to Stevie Wonder on the stereo. How beautiful she looked when her long hair fell over her shoulder and teasingly hit her cheeks. About the only duty I had toward Justin was holding his leash. He wasn't exactly a well-trained dog. In fact, he tugged exuberantly and made walking him a chore. Any reprimand would be forgotten in a matter of seconds. Losh said it was only fair that I walk him because she had to carry the beer in her purse. We would take Justin to the park and let him run to his heart's content. Late in the evenings, just before bed, we took him for one last stroll in the empty lot across the street. This lot on Bleecker Street was the size of a large city block. It had been empty for many years since public pressure had suspended destruction of old homes for high-rise developments. In the meantime, it was overgrown with grass, bushes, and formerly backyard trees. This one particular night there was a full moon which hung low in the sky. Its pale silver light bathed each tree and branch in gentle beauty. As usual, we walked Justin down to the end of the lot, and sat down to smoke a cigarette on a log, slipping Justin's leash around a branch. As we sat there, reaching instinctively for each other's hand, a most intense sexual desire crept into our eyes. Losh looked wild, the moonlight on her face radiating an animalistic energy. We embraced and tumbled off the log to the ground. Only those clothes were removed or lowered as necessary, and our bodies joined each other urgently as we began the ritual of love. The dampness of the ground against our skin, the scent of the lush vegetation mingling with the musk of our love, and the moon and stars swirling over our heads. These are the things best remembered. When we were back at the apartment, she sat on the bed, picking the leaves and twigs out of her hair. There was a most intriguing smile on her face. When I remarked upon it, she said she was remembering the way her mother smiled one morning, particularly bright and cheerful. Losh had asked her why, and she replied with a wink that she and her old man had slept together last night. Justin didn't last long. The occasional lapse in house training quickly brought him into disfavor. It was surprising, however, because of the fuss Losh made over him in the beginning. I think to some extent she was trying to compensate for being separate from her daughter, but unsuccessfully so. Losh's love for her daughter was an alive, yearning ghost that wouldn't lie still. The thought she was giving her up with the knowledge there was still time to change her mind was torturous to her. One evening, after we'd been drinking steadily, I came into the living room to find Losh sitting on the windowsill, with her legs dangling over the edge, and her entire body outside the half-raised window. It scared the hell out of me, and I grabbed her around the waist and forcibly yanked her inside. Still struggling, I pulled her over to the bed, and held her there till she quieted down. She gave me shit for thinking she was going to jump. I told her that wasn't what I was worried about. I was afraid she would slip and fall. I thought it was over, but no sooner had I gone to the washroom than she climbed back out on the windowsill. When I returned, saw what was happening, and started walking to the window, she went through the motions of threatening to jump. I had no choice but to sit back calmly on the bed. It was only 3 stories down. I doubt if it would be fatal, but the chances were she'd be seriously hurt. I forget what I said to her. I only know that she eventually climbed back in of her own volition, lay down on the bed beside me, her arms hanging on to me tightly, and tears running down her cheeks. She often said she has a premonition she would never live until she was 23. I had put it down to the insecurity of youth, but just for a moment I caught a glimpse of her deepest fears. Financially, things were tighter than ever. The long-expected advance on the Rochdale file continued to elude us, partly because of the bust in April. Losh had legally separated from me. For a few weeks she actually rented another room, although we slept each night at our apartment. It was the last days of June, and summer was at its best. Once we went to a park by a ravine that Losh used to visit several years before. We strolled arm in arm along the pathways and stopped eventually for a picnic of sandwiches and beer. As the sun sank below the horizon and dusk gathered, we fell to the ground and made love. Perhaps the possibility of being seen or caught, however unlikely, increased the intensity of our pleasure. Losh, Part 4. Sing no sad song for me, buy me no floral wreaths. Grieve not for me, and don't wear black. Rejoice for me and with me, surround me with simple flowers, pale violets and white roses. Wear white or light colors. Do not be selfish, but be happy, for I will be happy, and that is how I wish you to be. Let your tears be only of joy. Please contain your sobbing, for its sound will surely tear my heart. Do not miss me so very much, because I will always be here. If you must cry, cry softly, and whisper your last goodbyes. Don't speak of regrets for past hurts. The past is too far behind me, and all is forgiven. Pass lightly over my faults, and think not of my misdeeds. Remember only the good times, and that I'll always love you. Loretta Lynch. Losh had been wanting to return to Winnipeg for some time now. In fact, she had left once without me, but had gotten lonely the first night on the road and turned back home. We agreed on a date towards the end of June. When that date arrived, we had only 10 days left to move into new quarters. With characteristic slowness, I had not even found a place to move to. We woke around 7 and got out of bed at 8 o'clock. Losh cooked some breakfast while I packed the knapsack and sleeping bag. Both of us were tingling with that feeling of excitement in our stomachs that you feel when undertaking a long journey. At 9 o'clock I had a burst of inspiration and went to see a friend of mine, arranging to move into his community house, and paid rent on a room in advance. That removed the major qualm I had about taking the trip, and I became more enthusiastic. Losh was glad to have an address to get in touch with me on her return. We agreed to hitchhike to Winnipeg together, probably within 3 days. I would spend a day, maybe two, meeting her family, then return to Toronto. Losh, on the other hand, would stay with her family for a couple of weeks, until she had earned enough or arranged for a train ticket home. She would call me at our new telephone number, and I would meet her at the station. We left our apartment with high hopes and expectations. On the way, we stopped at the Isabella Hotel for a couple of beers, just to start the trip off in the right frame of mind. It was 3 o'clock before we reached Highway 400 and started to hitchhike. 2 or 3 cars came in succession. Losh would sit in the back looking out the window or napping, while I sat in front of the driver, engaging him in conversation. From Huntsville to Sudbury, we got a ride in a Volkswagen van and relaxed in the back together, smoking and drinking a couple of beers and holding hands. Our spirits soared with the hum of the tires bearing us northwest. We made Sudbury around 10 o'clock that night, just in time to buy a case of 12 from the local brewer's retail. Our next ride was with a couple of short-haired rednecks who looked suspiciously like cops and wanted to buy some marijuana from us. When told we didn't touch the stuff, they dropped us off immediately at the nearest traffic light. It took a couple of hours to get a ride out of the city. By 1 a.m. we were only 20 miles west of Sudbury. Seeing as it was so late, we decided to camp for the night by a lake we had seen from the highway. The sky was cloudy and it was hard to see. Even with the pocket flashlight we had bought, it was difficult to make our way through the thick bushes and fallen logs. Eventually we reached the shore of the lake. We trampled down some weeds, spread out our sleeping bag, and leaned our knapsack against a tree. Within minutes we had a small fire kindled, which helped keep away the mosquitoes. This was the life, we told ourselves, sitting around a campfire getting mellow. One man, one woman, alone in the forest gloom. I wondered how our lives would have been different if we had been born several hundred years ago. No factories, no welfare, no bust by the RCMP. Losh looked natural in the woods, as if she was at home there. I wished we could be gypsies, free at last, and no one to pay rent to but God. There was but one moment of paranoia. Losh thought she saw a flashlight coming from the direction of the highway. We quickly stashed the weed I had with me and the beers. Then, upon Losh's insistence, we began to investigate the strange light, which shone for a few minutes, went off, and came back on again. To our surprise and relief, it wasn't the flashlight of the OPP, who might have seen our fire from the highway. It was only the moon playing hide and seek with the cloud-scattered sky. We returned to the campfire and laughed so hard there were tears in our eyes. Shortly afterwards, we shed our clothes and climbed into the single sleeping bag. It was a tight squeeze. We fell asleep holding each other and whispering our love. We rose early as soon as it was dawn and quickly packed our knapsack and headed back to the highway. The sun rose higher in the sky and the hours passed, but with no result. The cars that passed by just wouldn't stop. We took a short break from hitchhiking to make love in the foot-high grass of a nearby field. The sun blazed fiercely on my back and in Losh's eyes. Together we celebrated the fertility of the corn god, and it was a memorable event. When we finally did get a lift, it was some local white bastard in a pickup truck. His first question was whether we were short of money. His second question was how would my woman like to pick up some extra cash. Our response was to tell him to stop the truck and let us out. It took us all day to cover a couple 100 miles. We reached Sault Ste. Marie around midnight, but Losh wanted to keep on going to make Winnipeg as early as possible. We got stuck in a small village called Batchewana at 2 o'clock in the morning. We stood on the highway for a couple of hours, but there wasn't any traffic. Finally, we decided to get a couple hours rest snuggled up in the sleeping bag. We were up again at dawn, covered with mosquito bites. Traffic was still scarce. When it came, it was usually a camper or a boat trailer. Families on holiday almost never gave you a lift. Losh and I amused ourselves by playing silly little games to pass the time. My favorite was taking turns tossing pebbles, trying to get as many as possible on the narrow strip separating the two white lines. When a couple of hours passed and the village's only restaurant opened, and Losh and I went in for a cup of coffee. Soon we were standing by the side of the road again while the sun got higher and the temperature got hotter. We had counted on making Winnipeg in a maximum of 3 days. This was the third day already, and we had barely covered 500 miles. I didn't say anything to Losh, but decided that I would have to turn back tomorrow morning, unless we got a ride straight through. Noon came, and the village's only pub opened. Losh and I went inside for a couple cold beers. Then we were back on the road again. I had a battered old Anzac hat, which had been given to me by a friend who was leaving for Nepal. I wore it to keep the sun out of my eyes. At first Losh laughed at it and said she was embarrassed to be seen with me wearing such a funny-looking thing. As the sun grew hotter, she decided to try it herself. From that time on, it was half hers and half mine. Around 3 o'clock, Losh turned to me and suggested we turn back. I smiled with relief. As if to confirm that we had made the right decision, we got a lift almost immediately going back towards the Sioux. Losh and I were in high spirits. There was no longer any deadline to meet, and we could take a couple of days going back to Toronto. At least it was a pleasant break to get away from the big city. We stopped in the early evening at a campground east of the Sioux. There was a big sign painted on a railway bridge saying, "This is Indian land." The campground was called Ojibwe Park, and it was owned and run communally by the reserve. A sign said it was $5 a night for trailers and $3 a night for cars. Losh looked at me questioningly, but I shook my head. We didn't have enough money. Losh asked the attendant how much it was for hitchhikers. The Indian attendant looked slowly through his book, then announced he didn't say anything about hitchhikers, and he waved us through. It was a beautiful spot. The campsites were covered with a thick layer of pine needles, and a sandy beach opened onto Lake Superior. We built a campfire before dark, happened to be with each other and sleeping under the stars. We slept till about 9 o'clock. Our lack of sleep was catching up with us. Even then we were loath to go back to the highway. Instead we lay about the campsite, and around noon we went swimming in our spare clothes. It was the first time this year that either of us were in the water. We splashed about like a couple of puppies. Afterwards we went back to the campsite and lay down to let the sun dry us off. In the late afternoon we hitchhiked into Sault Ste. Marie. Our intention was to stay the night in their well-known youth hostel and go to Welfare in the morning to make sure we had enough funds to get home. Things went wrong from the very start. Losh phoned the hostel only to find it was disbanded. There wasn't likely to be another one either, inside or outside the city boundaries in the near future. Apparently it was a backlash against all the young hikers that had passed the Sioux in their journeys back and forth across the country. Losh wanted to try the Salvation Army because she was tired of mosquitoes, wanted to sleep between sheets again. Everything went fine until he asked us whether we were legally married. We explained we'd been living common law for almost a year. To our surprise, they offered Losh a room, but not me. I told Losh to take it. I would wait for her outside. They'd given Losh a voucher for a downtown hotel. She went ahead and booked the room, and then we went back together. It was a run-down hotel, but the old woman at the desk freaked when she saw us together. She started calling us all kinds of names and saying it was people like us that spoiled it for the rest. Losh got mad and went upstairs to get her things. Well, I told the old lady in so many words to shove it. We spent the night in the park, mosquito-bitten and damp from a drizzling rain. It was hard not to compare the reception we were given by her people, the Indians, at Ojibwa Park, with the reception given to us by my people, the whites, at the Salvation Army. Why is it that our white civilization seems to be based on greed or guilt? So often when we compared our cultures, it was the white race which came out the loser, if not in wealth, then in its humanity. I, for one, was glad to get back to Toronto. Even Losh was happy to listen to the stereo, watch the Late Show, and sleep between sheets again, without a mosquito landing on her nose. Home sweet home, but it wasn't to last forever. 2 days later we moved into our new home on Prospect Street. In one sense it was a step down for us. We were leaving a 2-bedroom private apartment and moving into one room in a community house. Our new room wasn't large. It held our bed, the stereo, the television, and our paintings. I also had space in the basement for my office. The desk, bookcase, typewriter, and extra chairs went down there. We shared the bathroom and kitchen with 3 other people, but they were gentle people, and the landlord of the house was an old and respected friend from 15 years ago. We also had access to a common TV room on the 3rd floor, but hardly ever went there, preferring the privacy of our own room. At first both of us were slightly worried about how lack of privacy might change our relationship, but our lives really changed very little. Within a couple of weeks we were confident that at least in that respect things were working out well. The most appealing thing about our room was the window. Being summer, it was open all the time except for sudden rainstorms. It faced south towards Lake Ontario. The outside walls of the house were covered with ivy, and little sprigs actually seemed to be climbing in the windowsill. Starlings and sparrows roosted in the ivy. In the early morning and at dusk and after a rainstorm they chirped and twittered, taking off suddenly and soaring through the sky only to come back home to roost in the ivy. The best parts of our day, as usual, were when we were making love. We did so frequently. Losh was all woman. Sexuality was the key to her nature. Even when we were lying on the bed watching TV, She would sometimes undo my belt and zipper and gently remove my sex. She would lay her cheek upon, fondle it, caress it with her hair, or kiss it, taking a childish delight in making it respond to her will. She was fascinated by the male organ, often told me that if she ever put a book together, it would be a collection of photographs of penises of all shapes, colors, and sizes, and in all its states from erection to repose. I wasn't so keen on the idea, not even when she appealed to my ego and said that mine would be on the cover. It wasn't that I doubted the artistic value of such a book. I had enough confidence in Losh's taste that I knew the effect would be beautiful rather than pornographic. I just didn't like the thought of Losh walking around sizing men up, asking them if they'd like to be in her book. We could joke about such things that didn't really bother us. What really amazed me was our love continued to deepen and grow, even through trials and tribulations. We had almost been married a year, and we still held hands as if we were on our honeymoon. Something unique to both our experiences. We'd never known love like that before. We would never know love like that again. Nothing that good could last forever. Disaster struck on Saturday, July 5th. When we woke in the morning, Losh was frightened. She had had a nightmare that we had been busted. I held her in my arms, stroking her hair, and asked her to remember as much as possible. I wasn't trying to frighten her, but I respected dreams and felt we should be extra careful for the next little while. Usually Losh could recall details of her dreams at will, but this time she could only recollect the certainty that we had been busted. I caressed her and nibbled at her ears and neck. Slowly I aroused her passions, and we made love with wild abandon. That seemed to brighten her smile, and we forgot the previous night's omens. Later that afternoon, a friend called from Hamilton and said he was coming to Toronto to visit me. He and his woman showed up around 4. We drove around town for a while visiting friends, then came back to the house and went up to our room for a smoke and idle chatter. They left around 8 in the evening. Losh and I were just cleaning up the room when the doorbell rang. Losh went down to answer it. I didn't think anything of it until Losh called my name. There was something unusual in her voice, and I knew immediately what was wrong. I barely had time to swallow about a gram of hashish before 5 narcs ran up the stairs. Losh, one of the 3 other boarders who just happened to be home, and my friend from Hamilton were brought into our room, with 2 narcs alternately searching and firing questions. The other 3 narcs searched the rest of the house. Losh sat down beside me on the floor and put her arms around me. I tried to console her, telling her everything would be okay. They didn't find anything in our room, but brought in the booty from the rest of the house, including an armload of plants they found on the roof, and ironically didn't belong to any of those present, including myself. They left no doubt as to who they were out to get. They pointed directly to me and told the others if they made a statement that the cannabis was mine, then they wouldn't be charged. No one said anything, if only because none of the cannabis they found was mine. The police laid 1 charge of possession of hashish and 1 charge of possession of marijuana against Losh, myself, and the other boarder. They then laid an additional charge of trafficking in hashish against myself. Losh and the other boarder were giving citations. My friend from Hamilton and myself were to be taken to the station and booked. I kissed Losh goodbye, told her to keep a stiff upper lip, to come and bail me out if they held me for parking tickets. Losh phoned the station around 10. They told her I would soon be released. She phoned again around 12, and I got a chance to talk to her. I told her I was okay, but they were going to hold me on $24 worth of parking tickets, and could she please come down and bail me out. Poor Losh hitchhiked all the way out to the suburbs and paid my fine. They let me see her for a few minutes, but wouldn't release me until I appeared before a justice of the peace on the charge of trafficking in hashish. They wouldn't even give Losh a lift back to the city. The subways had stopped and she hitchhiked all the way home to wait for me. I wasn't released till 3 in the morning. It was 4 before I got home. Losh was sitting up at the window waiting for me. We hurriedly undressed and got into bed, anxious to be warm and close to each other at last. Sunday was a very depressing day. It was like waking up to a huge hangover, the memory of the bus the day before. The charges from the first raid in April wouldn't come to trial until September 20th, still 2 months away. Now there are more charges. God knows how many months and remands that would be. Poor Losh had 3 charges of possessing cannabis against her, and she didn't even smoke dope. Her only crime was loving and living with me. As for myself, I had smoked cannabis for the last 10 years and expected to for the rest of my life. But I had never been in trouble before. Why the sudden persecution? Hell, I wasn't a drug dealer, I was a writer and publisher. If I got a little money together, I spent it on publishing books, not investing my capital in dope. If making money was my scene, then we wouldn't be on welfare, struggling each day to make ends meet. In the latest charges, 98% of the seized contraband they were trying to pin on me were plants that were up to 4 months old. They weren't mine. In fact, we had only moved in 3 weeks ago. It looked like it was a vendetta of some sort. Also raised the ugly possibility. If they were that determined to get me, then what guarantee did we have that they would stop if we were found innocent of the charges to date? None whatsoever. In fact, it seemed likely they would continue to bust us until the charges stuck and I went to jail. What was Losh supposed to do while I was in jail? Bad luck never comes singly, it brings company. That very morning, Losh got a telephone call. I heard her hang up, dial a number, and hang up again. When she came into our room, she asked if we could make love. I said sure, but what was wrong? She was obviously distraught. She said she wanted to make love first because afterwards I would want to. I took her by the shoulders, made her sit on the bed, and asked her to explain everything. The telephone call was for my old friend and arch-enemy Jimbo, the same colored man Losh had been going with when I met her and we started living together, the same man who ripped me off for $8,000 and incidentally put my neck on the chopping block because the money wasn't mine. She explained that he had phoned asking her casually what was happening and asked her to meet him at his house in the evening. Losh wasn't sure what she should say and said that she would phone him back. He said that she couldn't because his old number had been disconnected. She didn't believe him and phoned him back. Sure enough, he answered the phone. That's when she hung up and came in the room to tell me what was happening. She had never told me this before, but he had phoned 2 days after the bust in April with a similar proposition. As if the things weren't clear enough, she drew the obvious conclusion that he had been making anonymous calls to the police, hoping I would be arrested and sent to jail. I could imagine how quickly the son of a bitch would be around to console her. As if to confirm everything, the telephone rang again. I answered it, but there was nothing but silence on the other end. Finally, I told him to come down and face me like a man and hung up. Losh threw herself sobbing on the bed. She said it was her fault. The rip-off, the busts, everything, and that Jimbo had done it to get even with me. If she hadn't met me, then none of this would have happened. I lay down beside her and dried her tears with my kisses. I could taste the salt on my lips. Nothing that's happened in the past can be changed. Even if it could, I wouldn't trade the year of happiness we had so far for all the Mercedes-Benz in the world. Despite our fears, we made love afterwards. More than ever, I was aware that we had all we had in the world was each other. In the afternoon, we went for a walk over to Wellesley Park. In the evening, we watched the Hellstrom Chronicles on television. It's an excellent movie. The photography was matched by the life and death questions it raised about survival and purpose as a species. It was an acid trip without drugs. helped us forget our personal problems at least for a while. We quarreled after the movie and then made up to each other in bed. It was a restless night for both of us. In the morning, Losh accused me of having woke her up several times during the night, although as I remember it was the other way around. I had to appear in court in the afternoon. Losh asked me if I wanted her to be there. I said it was up to her, knowing how much courts depressed me, but for her unerring feel for the truth she decided to come, knowing it was a comfort to me just having her close. It turned out to be convenient as we both applied for legal aid and got that part over with. I had my case remanded to August 20th, the same day as my co-defendants were to appear in court. Afterwards, we walked out into the bright sunlight and sat down on the courthouse steps. I had to go to the printers to pick up some plates. Losh wanted to go home. I gave her $4 to pick up some beers and agreed to meet her around 5 o'clock. When I got home, she was sitting in our room with an old friend of hers. He was aging fast and walked slowly with a cane. I nodded to him as we had met several times before and got some cold beer from the fridge. When I returned, I sat down on the bed beside Losh. She put her arm around me. I noticed with pride that she had been showing him a couple of books I had written. After a couple of hours, she had decided to walk him home to his apartment in St. Jamestown and pick up a tape that he had made for her of a Stevie Wonder album. I was invited to go along and drink some wine, but I was hungry and more concerned with getting supper ready. It was agreed Losh would pick up the tape while I got the groceries from Dominion store. Losh wasn't home yet when I returned from the store, so I popped the steak into the oven and peeled the potatoes. She phoned me about 20 minutes later and asked me to come over, but I explained the steak was already in the oven and suggested she come home in 15 minutes or so. When half an hour passed and she still wasn't home, I grew impatient and went ahead and ate my dinner, carefully leaving Losh's share in the oven. When another hour passed and still no sign of her, I started getting mad. I feared she was probably getting drunk and enjoying herself, or even had gone out to a hotel for a few drinks. I had some business to take care of, but I could do it in a bar just as well as at home. I went over this. I had some business to take care of, but I could do it in a bar just as well as at home. And I went over to the Isabella for a couple of beers. I phoned my house around 11, just to tell Losh if she was home where I was at. My landlord and friend told me that a uniformed police officer had been to the house, and that I should go down to 51 Division immediately. I hurriedly hung up and gulped down my beer. I found a taxi outside and gave him my destination. I was still mad about Losh. I don't know what had happened, but I could imagine. She probably went to a hotel for a couple of drinks and got picked up for being rowdy or punching out a waiter. I would bail her out, of course, just as she had bailed me out 2 nights previously, but boy, would I give her a piece of my mind. When we got there, I paid off the taxi and hurried inside the station, belligerently demanding the whereabouts of Losh from the desk sergeant. He directed me upstairs to a certain detective. I ran up the stairs 2 at a time. Once again, I demanded angrily to see Losh and know what she was charged with. The detective looked at me and said she was dead. I couldn't believe it. It had to be some lousy cop joke or a trick. I looked into his eyes. There was no hatred there, only sadness, perhaps boredom. I collapsed in a chair they shoved under me and put my head between my knees. I howled with grief and pulled my hair as if the pain I inflicted on my body, the more pain I inflicted on my body, the less I would feel the growing horror in my heart. Tears flowed in a rush down my face and hands. A series of thoughts occurred to me. I wanted to punch a cop in the face. I wanted to throw myself out the window. I wanted to crawl into a corner and disappear into insanity. Nothing happened except tears and more tears. After the initial shock wore off, I gained a little self-control and blew my nose in the wastepaper basket. A kind of numbness and unreality set in. They asked me all sorts of stupid questions, like what was my relation to the deceased, how long I had known her, how old was she, where did we live, was she upset about anything. I told them she was upset, mostly about her daughter and what was going to happen to her. I also told them being busted 2 nights previously didn't help. She had 3 criminal charges against her. She didn't even smoke dope. One of the cops asked me if the dope didn't belong to her, then who did it belong to? I looked at him with disbelief and disgust. What kind of animal would tell you your wife was dead in one breath, try to extract a confession on a lousy pot bus with the next? I retreated to my chair and answered their questions numbly with a yes or no. I wanted to leave then, to be alone. They said I had to identify the body. They drove me to the city morgue in an unmarked car. It was like a bad police movie on television. Row on row of numbered aluminum boxes that slid out on rollers. The body was covered with a sheet. I recognized it was her by her feet alone. Still, they pulled back the sheet. It was Losh. Somewhere at the station they had told me she fell from the balcony on the 12th floor. Her face was so real and unmarked. She must have landed on her back and died instantly. Her eyes were still open. On her face was an expression of surprise. Not pain or agony, just surprise. I bent down and kissed her on the lips. It was a shock. Her face looked so normal, yet her body was so cold.